Welcome all. My name is John Bird, and I'm representing the Strategic Studies Department here at Joint Special Operations University. Today we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker, including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and the opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or USSOCOM.
Hey, good morning. I am Dave Oakley, a faculty member at JSOU. Today I have the privilege of chatting with Mr. Chris Costa, the Executive Director of the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., and a member of SOCOM's Hall of Honor. Hey, good morning, Chris. It's great to see you again.
Hey, Dave. It's great to join you this morning. Thank you very much.
You know, you've had a fascinating career in special operations and intelligence that ranges from the tactical to the operational levels up to the strategic levels where you advise policymakers. During that time, you conducted a variety of intelligence and special operations in conflict areas and war zones, to leading special operators as a deputy director at the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, to serving as a special assistant to the president and senior director for counterterrorism at the White House. Such a distinguished career that, as I mentioned, briefly just a few minutes ago, that led to your 2013 induction into the Commando Hall of Fame. It is also a career that seems to me has touched, at every level from tactical to the highest of strategic, and through some very important transition points in American history. By my count, and I'm not good at public math, but you experienced at least 3 U.S. strategic turning points. Entering during the latter part of the Cold War, you experienced the U.S.-Soviet competition at that time. You then served in the first Gulf War when the U.S., at least partially exercised the ghost of Vietnam that had lingered around. And then shortly thereafter, the completion of that war, you witnessed the fall of the Soviet Union. You then experienced the peace dividend of the 1990s and the not so peaceful, low intensity conflicts. And then you were in uniform on 9/11 and dedicated a great deal of your life to the global war on terrorism and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now you're serving as the executive director of the International Spy Museum. And so, which seems to me a great position to educate the public, on your experience during those transition points and also forecasting to the future. As the U.S. is experiencing another turning point towards strategic competition, can you reflect for a moment on how SOF navigated these previous transitions and are involved based on the challenges of these earlier strategic environments?
Yeah, first, again, Dave, thank you very much for having me. And I really appreciate you observing what's exactly right, that we're both in the business of educating the public on the important work that's gone on in our pasts, right, from a historical standpoint and from a personal point of view. So I am very grateful to continue to give back, and thank you for hosting me today. So yeah, right up front, you hit the nail on the head. I was at inflection points, to include in Panama in the late 1980s, all the way through the narrative that you've briefly conveyed. And I will tell you, when I served at the White House, another 2 quick points. One, I recognized that all of those experiences provided a significant competitive advantage when making recommendations to the president and to principals. I felt very confident. For the first time in my life, it all converged together at the White House, where I was very comfortable offering advice based on those variegated experiences I had through 34 years, up until that point, 34 years in government service. But also, I didn't fail to reflect on the lessons that were taught to me by non-commissioned officers and special operators throughout my entire career. My identity was far more linked to special operations in the command that you serve than it was to, Fort Huachuca, Arizona. I say it with some regret, right? Because I was an Army intelligence officer. And I guess I'll close that first question by offering that Bosnia We don't talk a lot about that particular experience, but it truly was this twilight between peace and war. In the operators that I worked with post 9/11 operationally, the ones that served with me in Bosnia, we recognized that that became a bit of a dress rehearsal for operating in an environment that was gray. It wasn't black or white, and it was very, very complex. That gave us an advantage on 9/11 because many of us had worked together in an environment where political consequences were high. It wasn't a lethal battlefield per se, but the work that we had to do, the sensitivities at a political level were very helpful. So all of those experiences, in short, really helped me. And I say that with all humility.
That is great. One of the things I found from my own research is, and I think we to echo your point, we often overlook those wars, those operations in the 90s. And I think it set the foundation for, a lot of the partnerships that we saw really blossom after 9/11. And I think without that, it would have been we would have got there, but it would have been a much more uncomfortable ride to get there.
No, you're exactly right. And I think to put a finer point on it, now, in fact, there's a whole generation in the interagency as well as in SOCOM that's experienced nothing but counterterrorism. So as we fight this GPC fight between peace and war, this gray zone environment, we're going to look back on the partnerships that were forged during the counterterrorism fight. So I think all of that learning is absolutely critical as we move forward.
The first question I had, you co-authored an excellent article in June 2020 with Kevin Bilm, so about a year ago. The title of which is "Look at Great Power Competition Through a Special Operations Lens." You had a lot of great points that, to me, focused on the value and utility of SOF as we switch to the strategic competition focus. Could you discuss a little bit of what inspired you to write that article and discuss some of its key takeaways?
So sticking with the theme on giving back, I mean, our charge, right, as senior leaders is to mentor and coach. So again, with humility, I will tell you that I mentored and coached to the extent that I could Kevin Bilms, who came from another government agency, and he served as my special assistant, then executive assistant at the White House. And Kevin and I, fought the CT policy fight together. And it was Kevin that then went to the Pentagon, and he had this idea, and I had encouraged him to write, get his articles approved, get his name out there, and be a strategic thinker. And he took that advice to heart. So he reached out to me, and candidly, he did the bulk of the work in that article. And we came together, and frankly, we both got credit for it. But I want to really shout out Kevin. But the point being, he was doing a lot of thinking about special operations. He had just left the policy realm, and then he stepped over to special operations, low intensity conflict and irregular warfare activities at the Pentagon as a very junior, young professional. And Kevin outlined a theme, and that theme is, how are we going to reconcile this idea of global power competition with SOF? And he hit all the right tones, and I just fleshed it out a little bit for him. And in short, we're going to be operating in a gray zone environment. It's going to be this twilight between war and peace, and it's going to be in a gray area. And we started to understand that was the fight that we fought, even from a counterterrorism standpoint. When I thought we were focused on a counter ISIS, a counter Al-Qaeda fight, I realized that particular fight, just in Syria as an example, was wrapped into a much broader fight that began to be this counter-influence fight, which meant we were countering Russians in the space, countering maligned Iranian activities on the ground in Syria, not to mention we're dealing with erstwhile partners, the Turks, making it very difficult for us to operate. We were having open dialogue with the Israelis. This is more like GPC in the future. Now, we didn't have Chinese actors, but if you threw the Chinese in, then we'd be talking about exactly the kind of fights that we're going to be fighting. And it was vying for influence. And I guess the key theme in that paper, we wanted to make sure we built that in. And that's the idea that it's special operations and special operators that are the world's best problem solvers. So wherever we go with this next particular fight, we have to rely on our leadership and our subordinates, because they're the best problem solvers. And I think we made that point. I hope we made that point strenuously enough.
Now, you mentioned two things that I think are very important, and as I kind of follow up questions, you highlight the complexity and all of the different players in the environment in Syria, and it brings to my mind, the role and importance of partners and allies in strategic competition. Can you talk a little bit about how you can use SOF to help nurture that relationship with partners and allies, or to leverage that relationship with partners and allies?
Yeah, no, great question, Dave. So I truly believe that the experience that our SOF non-commissioned officers and officers throughout the CT fight, the relationships that they built became the foundation for going broader and bigger with just a different manifestation of the fight, meaning countering Russian malign influence down the line and Russian malign behavior. The credibility of SOF operators working in the interagency domain and with foreign partners, it becomes a natural fit for just the same kind of TTPs, tactics and procedures, just a different adversary. So those lessons learned are going to be harnessed and they're going to be operationalized. They have to be. So those same networks, as we talked about before we started chatting live, those same networks used for counterterrorism can be repurposed to focus on other more specific missions. Just for example, if you can illuminate a counterterrorism network with the intelligence, with surveillance, with tools, with sensitive activities, then you can certainly repurpose to illuminate a counterproliferation network, maybe in a country that we don't operate in routinely. So that's what I'm talking about, those lessons learned, those relationships that we've harnessed in the CT fight. Just as an aside, Five Eye Partners Plus, all of the relationships that I built over the years converged when I was at the White House with foreign partners in very formal settings. Those same partners, who have remained, friends with me as I've moved into the private sector, those same individuals are hungry for working with the US government to fight different problems. Australians, for example, are very much concerned about a China in the future. We could go on, but I think that just reinforces the point that the lessons that we learned yesterday will apply to tomorrow's battlefields.
On our earlier discussion, you talked about what I thought was beautiful, the currency of CT. And what I took away from that, it seems to me with the strategic competition, there's a discussion that is, you can either do strategic competition or CT, right? It's an or. But what you really laid out, it's an and. And the gains, and this is what I took from the currency, was the partnerships that we developed and use Africa, for example, by helping countries, Nigeria and others, with some of the ways that they think about CT and the engagements we have with them. That puts, for lack of a better way to say, that's an investment in the bank that nurtures that partnership that benefits us in strategic competition.
And you make an excellent point. Those relationships that were built are going to be absolutely pivotal as we move forward, because CT is a currency. And this is based on a lot of reflection. I mean, when I left the White House, I was absolutely exhausted, and it was just 1 year, 7 days a week. But I knew this was going to be the end of my active service career after 34 years. So I wanted to do everything I could to enable counterterrorism for the nation. I mean, we owe that for the nation. But I also never forgot that I represented, at some level, I was representing General Thomas's headquarters, and I was a SOCOM body detailed to the president as one of his officers for counterterrorism. All of that said, I also, when I reflected on that year, I realized CT opened the doors. It was the one idea we could talk about practically as well as theoretically and policy-wise. It was the one thing we could talk about that wasn't divisive necessarily with foreign partners. In other words, we were aligned. I mean, there were 73 countries at one point in the counter ISIS task force. You can just imagine some large number of those 73 countries sent their diplomats to see me at the NSC, me and others, certainly, but they had to talk to me because CT was first and foremost in their minds as they fought the counter ISIS fight, whether that was with funding or with troops or with pumping fuel and aircraft from countries that we were never aligned with historically. So it was something easy to talk about. But when you walk in to talk about counterterrorism and you've experienced that with foreign partners, then you have the ability to lift and shift and say, hey, like we talked about, countering ISIS, we need to talk to you about malign Russian behavior, and we need to talk to you about how to counter some of the activities that are taking place in a space that is of interest to your country and our country. It opens the door. So GPC is a currency as well, but it has to be harnessed appropriately. And we have to train the next generation of individuals who know how to walk in with confidence and talk to an ambassador, talk to the State Department in a language they understand. We learned that in the counterterrorism fight. If you walk in to an embassy somewhere in the world and you have to talk about authorities, you've lost the fight before you open your mouth. And I could walk in and have a 2-hour conversation. We were both talking about authorities without ever mentioning it. And we had a modus vivendi. We understood what DOD could do, and they understood what their prerogatives were. I'm talking about the US mission. So there's an artful way of talking and communicating. And we learned all of that in the CT fight. So yeah, it's a little easier when you're born and bred in a counterterrorism fight. Now we have to adapt and adopt those lessons and apply it in GPC. But you referenced the article that I wrote in a lengthy interview in CTC Sentinel. I made the point a couple times that it is not mutually exclusive. We can continue to fight the CT fight, and we can work on global power competition. In fact, if we don't do both, we are at significant risk. And in fact, that's the last point I would make. Not to belabor the point, Dave, but the bottom line is CT has a way of sucking us back. And I walked into the Trump White House on day one. People said, hey, Chris, you're not going to be the biggest guy at the table. This isn't the last administration. We're not going to be overwrought with CT. And guess what? Look at the 4 years, you reflect on it. Some of the administration's greater achievements were CT. Some of the most controversial achievements were CT. Look at the current administration. Their legacy rests upon, in my humble opinion, how the CT fight is prosecuted post-Afghanistan, right?
You know, on the Afghanistan question, you know, what are your thoughts on the recent decisions in Afghanistan and the current condition, and how that affects the United States moving ahead with partners and nurturing those relationships?
So that's a great question also, Dave. So I want to think on a strategic level, all of the special operators that are working with partners, all the DOJ prosecutors that are trying to get people to cooperate with the United States government, all the human professionals, doesn't matter what agency, or foreign partners that are out there spotting, developing, and recruiting assets. All of them now are challenged to reinforce that we won't abandon friends and partners and agents and cooperators and confidential informants. And we are going to be significantly challenged. And when I say we, I'm sorry, that's the royal we, right? It's really the operators that are out there, and they have to have those conversations with their partners, because right now our record isn't on solid footing. The Kurds, who I served with in the 90s, on the ground in northern Iraq and southeast Turkey during Provide Comfort and post Provide Comfort, and then working with the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, from a policy standpoint, to be clear. But how do they perceive the United States? They talk about abandonment. They talk about betrayal. They've been far more forgiving, the Kurds in particular, of the United States. But now with Afghanistan, it's playing out. It would be very easy for me, and you're giving me a platform, which I'm very grateful for, but it would be very easy for me to be extremely critical. It is easy to be a critic. What's more important now is to assess, where do we go from here? So my advice to all operators is they have to have the conversation that they are personally committed to whatever kind of partners they're dealing with, and they have to reinforce that by actions. It can be done.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Circling it back a little bit, with a focus on the operators, as you just mentioned. And touching on some aspects in your article, you had some recommendations in the article on how to utilize SOF within their traditional 12 core activities during strategic competition. So I was hoping you could comment a little bit on that, and then also on maybe some different ways SOF could be employed in the new environment.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. So first of all, I went back and I looked at the list of 12 core SOF activities, and it's absolutely solidly grounded in a remarkable history from its very inception. All of that said, and I want to be provocative here, and I realize there's nothing more divisive than talking about unconventional warfare in particular in various aspects of counterterrorism, and from that list of 12, changing terms of art, making adjustments, reassessing, that can be very, very divisive, particularly the closer you are, to SOCOM headquarters, right? But we have to think more broadly. I don't care what you would call it, but we have to be in a position, again, the royal we, special operators, our future special operators, to counter, for example, Chinese intelligence officers that are operating somewhere on the African continent. Forget about the authorities for a second, complementing surveillance by other government agencies, doing preparation of the environment, which has become a cliche in some quarters. But the bottom line is we have to disrupt those activities, or the Russian intelligence service activities. Remember, the Russian intelligence services have become increasingly more aggressive. So I don't want to say we have to add a 13th core task of counterintelligence, but what do we call it when it's time? Because our operators have the experience, they have the training, they have the background, they've done this in the counterterrorism realm. What if their finish is all about photographs of a Russian intelligence officer in his activities in a foreign country? Because other agencies just don't have the kind of capacity that special operations has. What if the finish is all about an intelligence product that looks like photographs and looks a lot like developing pattern of life for a terrorist, but it happens to be an intelligence officer, that it's doing something disruptive somewhere in the world? I use the example generically of Africa. We the United States has to be prepared and special operators to adapt to that paradigm. And this is not a completely original idea on my part. Mark Polymeropoulos talks about it, a former CIA, decorated CIA officer that talks about that very scenario. And by the way, also know that that is exactly what's happened. This is all open source with MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, and the SAS, the Special Air Service. They are working to do exactly what I just outlined, according to open source reporting. MI6 and SAS are conducting surveillance activities against whom? Against Russian intelligence officers and Chinese intelligence officers. They're ramping up, and they stood up a Ranger unit to then focus on what SAS had been focused on, and that is the CT fight. Everyone is graduating and becoming, thankfully, much more sophisticated.
That reminds me of another point I liked about your that you're in Kevin's article. The using SOF for the exquisite understanding of the competitive landscape. And to me, the points that you bring up regarding CI and all that, at its foundation, that's about understanding. And it's about understanding and the ability to take informed action that's hopefully purposeful. One of the things I always grapple with is, how do you get that exquisite understanding of the operator on the ground and feed that into a broader understanding of the policymaker, by the policymaker?
So here again, we fall back on the lessons that we learned in the Special Operations CT fight. The idea, again, talking about authorities to an ambassador, talking about preparation in the environment, that can be very repellent. We have to arm officers, and non-commissioned officers have to walk in with the sophistication. They absolutely can do that, to talk about the advantage that they provide because of their native, in some cases, their native language proficiency, because of their maturity, because of their experiences. They can provide added value. They are not competing with an intelligence product. They are out there providing atmospherics that nobody else can provide. And I am confident that our operators have got better. And really, this is where I didn't, parachute in, again, some what seem like maybe trite phrases, but the coin of the realm for this next fight is going to be sensitive activities, which obviously we can't talk about in an unclassed forum. But General Rich Clark, Admiral Mitch Bradley, they know the importance of sensitive activities. It is critical that we continue to refine those capabilities. We continue to operationalize the forces. We continue to ensure that they have the appropriate training and they're able to rehearse that training. And then there has to be a level of risk that the Pentagon is going to have to accept. And if I could, Dave, I don't want to go off topic. That was an excellent question, but again, being critical, I was at the National Security Council and I knew of the exquisite capabilities that SOCOM could marshal for tough problems. And I would take storyboards that I had access to, and I would walk them physically from my office over to General McMaster, the National Security Advisor, and the Homeland Security Advisor, Mr. Bossert, and I would lay out the capabilities in the products that were being delivered. But what I couldn't do, Dave, is I couldn't force the Pentagon to dislodge some of those policy recommendations and interject them into the policy process. That was up to the Pentagon. And I can't explain why that was so difficult, because those exquisite capabilities were not always unleashed. And I shared that frustration with General Votel in his closing days in the Army when he was still at Central Command. I had an opportunity to talk to him about that. And both of us had no particular explanation for that dynamic and that phenomenon, but it was frustrating for me because I knew the unique capabilities that SOCOM had. And I know that it would have resonated, or I think it would have resonated very much with the president, and certainly it did with his principles, but it somehow there's a big gap between a capability at the Pentagon and getting that dislodged and fed into the interagency NSC process that plays out for policy recommendations.
Thank you, Chris. Those comments and some of the stuff you said in the article regarding bias towards action has me thinking about two things. And so kind of two separate questions, but I view them as being connected, hard to separate. So the first one is a focus on education. And so to me, everything you're describing shows the importance, and your comments, we have to get away from a bias towards action. And, part of my takeaway from that is we can't approach every problem the same way just because maybe we had success in that in the past. And to me, this is all fundamentally about education and how we nurture the practitioner. There's always been kind of this, I would say, a fight or a struggle within professional military education between training on one hand and education on the other. And I'm going to say something maybe a little controversial. I think on training, we're excellent. We build great technicians that understand processes and can take action and apply violence and get results. Education, I think we struggle a little bit with. And I wanted you to comment from your experience. I know you talked about earlier, you used Wisner's, the book about Wisner, the Mighty Wurlitzer, as something that you read, and how you constantly, as a professional, went back towards education to help you understand and get beyond just being a technician.
No, thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about how important education is. And I will caveat that, I came from very, very humble roots, right? I attended Norwich University. I lived in a barracks instead of a normal campus, but it was an extraordinary experience, but great foundation at Norwich University. I earned a master's on my own with American Military University while deployed multiple times. And then I earned, courtesy of the US government, an amazing master's degree at the Naval War College. But tonight I'm teaching in a Georgetown University class. I mean, imagine that, right? I want to pinch myself, but it's been self-education that was the crucial force multiplier for me. In other words, I had the framing, I had the reference, I had brilliant instructors, I had people that had the kind of depth that you have. And I was very fortunate to always have encouragement. But at the end of the day, it was the books that are on my bookshelf that I packed away on a deployment. And I found a little time while I fell asleep, probably 10 or 15 minutes every night, if I, at best, right? We were exhausted, everyone is. But it was the self-education that became a significant force multiplier for me, complemented by the framing from universities, right? So I'll tell that to my students tonight. When 9/11 happened, I was uniquely positioned as a HUMenter, coming from a special mission unit at the time. I was unique, and a counterintelligence guy. I was uniquely positioned when 9/11 happened to ply my trade. And the Army, in their infinite wisdom, had said, Chris, you're doing such a great job. We're going to promote you below zone to lieutenant colonel. And by the way, we're going to send you to U.S. Army Recruiting Battalion, Albany. So I was taken out of the fight for the first year and a half. And I was almost despondent about that. But when I stopped feeling sorry for myself and started engaging with many of my recruiters, knowing they felt exactly how I did, what I fell back upon was self-learning. And it just so happened I was trying to get my head around this phenomenon of terrorism. And so I went to school on counterterrorism. So 1 month after changing command, I was prepared mentally to jump right in the fight. And that's exactly what I did. Within 30 days, I served in a special operations task force after changing out of a command, a recruiting command. But it was that the self-learning, the drive to read and understand and try to reconcile what I was seeing, that became an advantage to me when I jumped back into the fight.
The second part of that question relates to the experience. And so you've highlighted a lot of your experience working in the White House and understanding that environment. What do you say to the practitioner? I know what I have observed is, we speak about a lot about broadening assignments for mid-level practitioners, but we don't often reward those in the military, at least based on my experience in the Army. What do you think about the value of those experiences, stepping away from the muddy boots and understanding kind of the way that the policy environment works and how the tactical and operational environment is nested or should be nested with that?
So I strongly encourage pursuing, when it's appropriate for one's career, pursuing opportunities to parachute into the NSC as a director. It is an extraordinary experience. And by the way, I had 2 operators that came from special mission units, and both of them were by names, meaning I wanted them to come to the NSC, and their commands reluctantly, no, not reluctantly, they willingly gave those individuals up to serve because they knew how crucial it was. And what an advantage I had having those operators. But it wasn't about how many push-ups that they could do or sit-ups. It truly was about them in very short order pulling together the necessary outline for me to run a policy interagency meeting, and their ability to articulate that, to prepare the National Security Advisor or the Homeland Security Advisor. In some cases, after I left, there was more visibility directly with the President of the United States at the director level. It wasn't necessarily so early on in the administration, but all of that said, I know that those experiences were absolutely invaluable to those operators. So I strongly encourage it. And I'm not being self-effacing here deliberately, but I will say I never expected that I would have the opportunity to serve at the White House. And when I did have that opportunity, I was extremely, extremely aggressive. And in many cases, I got well ahead of Special Operations Command. And I probably owe a lot of people apologies for that by pushing the limit on the necessary paperwork to one day be assigned to Tampa and the next day be doing a move to DC with no orders, by the way. So don't do that on your own. It was painful, but SOCOM took very good care of me, and I was very grateful to General Thomas. But I strongly encourage those kinds of risks. And when you read other people's biographies and you learn about people that took risks with their own careers, it's calculated, it's got to be sorted with your family. And that's exactly what I did. My wife and I agreed to accept the risk of what we did. And it was absolutely counterintuitive to leave wonderful Tampa at the time, working with extraordinary people at the Tampa headquarters where we wanted to retire, and then completely changing everything literally overnight and jumping into Washington, DC, an environment that was completely and unequivocally alien to my wife and I, and yet somehow we adapted. So I would strongly encourage people listening to me to take those calculated risks and accept, angering some people, frustrating others, when it's for altruistic, for the right reasons, when it's not about ego and it's really about a mission you believe in, then you just have to execute to the best of your ability.
Hey, thanks, Chris. And if you ever get tired of the DC area, you have a place to stay if you ever want to come down here and visit Tampa. So you're more than welcome. One of the things you highlighted in this discussion and also some of your written work is the value of the soft mindset. Do you think the conventional force with the strategic competition and how dynamic it is, and as you pointed out, is really fundamentally about understanding and knowing your environment. Do you think the larger DoD should adopt some aspects of this soft mindset that you highlight?
I want to give credit to the entire Department of Defense. When I reflect on my career, I mean, I'm talking about all of the armed services in particular. When I reflect on my career, the individual service member are so extraordinarily well prepared. When I reflect on my career and my first rifle platoon, and they were amazing soldiers, but our force has become increasingly more sophisticated. The idea of the strategic corporal, much of that is also cliche, but I think all of our services understand the environment that they're in, and they are so well prepared. And that is credit to our armed services. Now, I would never, so all of that said, an infantry platoon is not a ranger platoon, is not a special forces ODA, an operational detachment. So we can't make the mistake of giving them missions that should be assigned, pardon me, to special operators. But all of that said, I believe the entire force is much more sophisticated. And I think we are starting in a much better place with the kind of young men and women that we're putting in the military today. And even in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, while I was feeling sorry for myself as a recruiting battalion commander, despite what I heard from my fellow recruiters, officers now, battalion commanders, for the most part, I really knew that this is going to be a special generation. And I think they've grown up in wars and they have become a special generation. So, I'm very impressed by the military that I interact with, which is limited now. So I would just say that a soft mindset, if we're talking about mission focused and more sophisticated, it's already permeated across the services.
Hey, thanks, Chris. No, I agree with your, I entered the military right before 9/11, 2 years before 9/11. And, although not perfect, I'm impressed with the way that we evolved, how we nurture the thought of the individual leaders, and we prepare them. And as I mentioned before this, my son's in an ROTC program now, and I'm pretty impressed with, even at the ROTC level, some of the stuff they're introducing cadets to. I'd like to shift a little bit to touch on, and before I do that, I'd like to remind the audience that they can ask questions. Just submit it via email to the email address that was mentioned at the beginning, and we'll ask those of Chris. But until then, what I'd like to do is shift a little bit and look at the soft IC relationship. Where it is currently at, following the 20 years of counterterrorism, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. What are the legacies, that affect that relationship, and how do you see it going forward?
So again, not to belabor the point, but I think because of counterterrorism as the currency it was, we now know each other's families in the interagency. That was strange in the 1990s when I began showing up with the appropriate badges into, other government agencies. That was alien. Nobody was detailed. Nobody worked in that space. But I uniquely had the opportunity to work in that space in the 1990s, before 9/11, and began to build the personal relationships. So the personal relationships that have been built from bleeding together in Afghanistan and Iraq, and working with foreign partners, working on tough problems, that really will solidify this next fight. So it's going to be the personal relationships. I had an opportunity in a station. The CIA chief somewhere in the world said, "Chris, I want you I want you, no hold bars. I'm doing an all hands in my conference room. And I want you to tell them what they need to do to change their behavior. And they need to understand who you are and where you come from and define for them how they're supposed to operate with you. And you talk about humility. I had to figure out how I could deliver the appropriate message. And some of what I was going to say, I knew wouldn't be necessarily well received. And I delivered that message because a chief said to me, be hard on them, tell them what they need to do. And I did. I laid that out for them. But the question is, how many chiefs would have done that? This was mid 2000s. Now, I would argue that there are lots of chiefs out there that grew up with serving side by side with the US military in Iraq, in Afghanistan. So those relationships are personal. And I think that's going to be a significant advantage because we all fought together in the 2000s, the early 2000s, the first decade in particular, and then the counter ISIS fight. So we've all built kind of a personal bond with one another. And I think that is really important.
Now, I tend to agree, and as you know, some of my own research kind of touches on that. And I, appreciate we have to make a transition to more strategic competition viewpoint. And so sometimes we have to understand and appreciate our partners shifting roles, focus, and responsibilities. But I agree with you, we cannot undermine that foundation of a partnership that we've nurtured over 20 years, and I would argue built upon from the 1990s. So no, I think you're spot on, sir. What I'd like to do real quick is just, give you some time to just impart some additional wisdom on the audience based on your experience and going forth with strategic competition, and how, whether SOF practitioners need to nurture themselves and think about preparing for this environment, or about the relationships that are essential for responding within this environment. So turn the floor over for you for some final thoughts.
So just some final reflections. You don't know how many enemies you might have made until you leave government service, right? Because a lot of who we are is based on our position. I was fortunate to realize when I left the White House that I spent a lot of time, particularly in the latter part of my career, trying to reflect on who I wanted to be, what I didn't like when I was a junior leader. And so when I was at the NSC, I could spend a lot of energy trying to be the leader that I wanted others to be when I had to walk in to brief a principal or a general officer. So that became another advantage that I had by just being good to subordinates and colleagues. And I think that's an important lesson that we can take into the interagency environment, that the conflicts that you have, you've got to ensure that they aren't, they don't permeate, your reputation, right? Your reputation is everything. The way you make others feel is very, very important. And I don't mean that in a real soft, way. I mean that people really are impacted if you make them, you can be hard on them and you can give them direct and candid feedback. But at the end of the day, it's the environment that you foster by providing clarity, by having two-way communications, that becomes a significant advantage to allowing your folks, whoever they are, to be problem solvers and bring them into the fold. And that's how you build trust. That's all important. So it really all comes back to relationship building, fostering an environment of mutual trust, which we do operationally, but also, but in the blue lines, right? And when we're in our own space here in the United States, in the interagency environment at SOCOM headquarters. So I really don't have that much wisdom to impart that many of you haven't already embraced, but I would just underscore that anything you do, if you do it with humility, I think that is a crucial crucial force multiplier. It certainly, the only book, I will share this with everyone, the only book I managed to really muddle through while I was at the White House, and I would usually fall asleep as soon as I opened up the next pages, would be a book about Ulysses S. Grant, a biography that was published, and I forget the author, but the humility that he demonstrated as a national leader, the humility that he demonstrated on the battlefield, how he made others feel around him, that was extraordinarily helpful for me to process. How do you go to work every day at the national level and execute with humility? I think it's really important. Actually, the book, thanks to my wife, is by Ron Chernow. It's Grant's magisterial biography.
Hey, Chris, thank you very much. I think that's a good way to end our discussion. I mean, you highlighted in that quick blurb the importance of relationships, of educating oneself, and I think of most important, and hopefully education does this, is humility. That attribute, nurturing that attribute within individuals. So, thank you very much for your time today. I know you're very busy. I also want to thank you for your service, not only, the 34 years in uniform, not only your time at the White House, but your continued service at the International Spy Museum as its executive director. To me, like as you mentioned earlier, JSOU and the International Spy Museum has an overlapping kind of role about educating practitioners, scholars, and the general public about, intelligence, special operations. And so thank you for that. I also wanted to thank you for my 12-year-old son. As you know, we recently moved here from DC, and that was his favorite location in DC. And in fact, he's still angry at me that I didn't take him there one last time. So thank you.
Well, bring him back, Dave. Thank you very much for the JSOU mission, which is absolutely crucial. And as I said, I have absolute trust and faith in SOCOM leadership. I know General Clark. He's a former colleague and a friend, Admiral Bradley at SOCCENT. I have absolute faith in the leadership and faith in the SOCOM enterprise writ large. It's not going to get any easier for Special Operations Command. I think it's going to get much more challenging. There's going to be no rest. CT is not going away, and global power competition will not go away. So we have an extremely complex fight ahead of us. I just really appreciate the opportunity to talk to SOCOM through the platform of Joint Special Operations University.
Well, thank you, Chris. And, thank you to the audience for joining us for this session of Think JSOU. You will also be able to find this recording and others on the JSOU's YouTube site. I also want to thank our technical magician behind the scenes, John Bird, for making me look taller, better looking for this event, and for making sure I didn't hit the wrong buttons. So thank you, and I hope everyone has a great day. I'd like to close by reminding the audience of our next quarterly Future of SOF Forum, which is on 8th and 9th September, where we'll discuss many of the issues talked about today, specifically the IC relationship over the past 20 years with SOF, and then the future of the SOF and IC relationship within a strategic competition environment. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great day.